I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you mean. I don't know what it means to say that God is all good or all powerful.
Conservative political activist Dinesh D'Souza here recently uploaded a video proving God's existence by using Anselm's ontological argument. My colleague and I sat with an atheist philosopher from the Ayn Rand Institute named Dr. Onkar Ghate to see exactly why Dinesh D'Souza was wrong. Stay tuned.
So we're going to agree on a definition, and Anselm supplies a definition which I think meets his criteria. His definition is this: God is that than which no greater can be thought. So in every respect, God is, you may say, the greatest. You can't even think of someone or something greater than God. That's the definition. And Anselm goes, do you agree when we talk about God? Would you agree that that is in fact a valid definition of God? And I think the answer to that question is yes.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing of how Dinesh is arguing it is that, well, we have to start on some type of definition, some common ground. But the reason why I kind of stopped here is that that common ground is not observable. It's not like we're pointing at reality. We're starting on something that we just made up from, we don't know where it comes from, and that's why I wanted to kind of bring it to you, Dr. Ghate, to kind of expand on what's wrong with his argumentation here.
Well, we all have a imagined idea of God that we somehow share, and it takes it as obvious that we all have it, and it's shared, that it's all the same. I don't think it is. So I think most people don't have an idea of God because the traditional idea, so far as you're thinking about it as sort of the traditional, in our culture, Judeo-Christian conception, God supposedly all-knowing, all-powerful, all good. I don't think you actually have an idea of what that means. So his is, we all agree on what it means. I don't know what it means to say that God is all good or all powerful. And when you get the kids asking questions, so can he make a stone that he can't lift, and so on, that's what they're basically saying. The kid is like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you mean. And so do you mean this, that he's so great that he can make a stone that he can't lift? And the kids, the replies they always get is, no, it doesn't mean that. Doesn't really have a body. It's just about, he's a kind of disembodied consciousness. So then if you ask, can he invent a math problem that he can't solve? It is, no, that's not what he's like. They keep telling you, no, it's not that, and pretend that, but you really have an idea of what God is. And I think people don't actually have an idea. They have the word, and they're told you're supposed to believe in something like this. But if you ask, like, do they actually know what it means? I think the answer is no. And kids' questions reveal that.
Is this not, because I think in Dr. Dinesh's defense, this is the only way to start, is kind of, I guess what my conception, the general conception is, like, we have to start with definitions. This is the important way to start on such philosophical topics. We have to at least come to some rational common ground of agreement where we can then go further. So isn't the proper place at least a definition? Like, you may say he's imagining things, but is this not the only place to start?
You generally don't start with definitions, even though it's true in education that sometimes, okay, we're talking about a triangle. We're going to define a triangle as a three-sided figure. But it's not how you actually start. You actually start by observing different kinds of shapes. And then you can say, oh, there's a square shape. It's four-sided. All the sides are equal. It has right angles. Here's a triangle. It has three sides, and so on. You start from the things that you actually encounter and observe. And it's a much later process that you say, this is how I define it. Like, this is what its essential characteristics or qualities are that distinguish it from other things. So you're dealing with something and you're trying to distinguish it from other things. That's when you start looking for a definition. Here, you don't yet know that there's anything that exists that you're trying to distinguish from other things. And so we literally are starting with, I can imagine something. That's how we start. And that's not how normal science works, that I can imagine this or I can imagine that. It's rather, look, we've encountered a magnetic field. Like, we've got two pieces, an iron and a magnet, and it's attracting that. Now, why? Like, what's happening there? And so how does it work? And then you might ask, like, how do we define a magnet or magnetism? So, but you don't start with, oh, I can imagine one body attracting another. And so that's not how science starts.
Anselm says, this God, this being than that, than which no greater can be thought, this being either exists in the mind alone or exists in the mind and in reality.
So there's so many things wrong in what he's saying there. One of them is this kind of comparison that something that exists in your mind, it can exist in your mind and out there in reality. Now, first of all, your mind is part of reality. So if you've got an idea and you've really got an idea, then it exists, and it exists in reality. It's an idea in your mind, but that's part of reality. So there's not this kind of dichotomy between either exist in the mind or exist in the mind and reality. If you've got an idea of something that exists in your mind, and that's part of reality. And you can't compare it as
can
though...
Can I push back on that a little
Yeah.
bit, Doctor? Because I don't think it's obvious that your mind exists in reality at all. I think that's a large question that, you know, science is always pushing on, especially nowadays, that your mind actually, in fact, is a tool of creating reality or distorting it. You know, through many tests, we see people kind of, or just, you know, the normal illusions or machinations that people have, mirages that people may have, or misconceptions about things. So how do you make a claim like the mind is in reality with such controversial evidence to the contrary?
Where else would it be? So if it's not in reality, where it's in non-reality? So
I was going to say, I have an interesting pushback real quick on that one. And it links into something you said before about you very firmly stated that he didn't give an actual definition. I'd say, wouldn't it depend on how you define reality and what the actual definition of reality is, which is kind of what we're searching for?
So the normal definition, or it's not really a definition, a characterization of reality is everything that exists. Now, the way he's using it is he actually means in either the physical world or the world outside of a mind or outside of consciousness. Okay, you can use it like that, and then you're distinguishing but it is, since what here we're talking about here is existence, and in the argument, it's the conclusion is supposed to be God exists. It's all about exists or not, and there's some kind of idea or a kind of perspective that what's in your mind doesn't exist, and that if it doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist. You can't talk about it, and you can't talk about it. It's somewhere, but not in reality, and so it just doesn't exist. So there's this kind of perspective that, oh, if it's in the world outside of the mind, then it exists, or it really exists, or it exists greater. But none of those qualifiers do I know what they mean. That it mean it's greater or it really exists, but if it's in the mind, it sort of kind of exists, but doesn't really exist. None of those have meaning, I think.
And then Anselm says, which is greater? Is it greater to exist only in the mind? Or is it greater to exist in the mind and in reality? Obviously the latter. And then Anselm says, but if that's true, then I've proven my case. Why? Because if God is that than which no greater can be thought, and that than which no greater can be thought either exists only in the mind or in the mind and in reality, it's obviously greater to exist in both. Therefore, that than which no greater can be thought must exist not only in the mind, but also in reality.
Anytime you're in an argument like this and someone says, obviously, you should be very suspicious. So his was something like, well, look, if it exists in the mind and in reality, it's obviously greater. Why is that obvious? What does it mean? So you take one of the other kinds of examples he brought up, a unicorn. Okay, you can imagine a unicorn. Now, if there's actually a unicorn prancing around, that's greater. And what's the that? You still have an idea in your mind, and there's a unicorn prancing around in a field. Why is that greater than just having a unicorn in your mind? Or put it the other, just a unicorn prancing around and you don't have an idea about it. That's somehow inferior to if a unicorn's prancing around and you have an idea about it.
I mean, you can actually interact with the unicorn. It's not something that you can just sit there and think about. You can actually, ride it or, observe it, watch and go around the farm or whatever. I don't know where unicorns live, but you get the idea.
But yeah, I get the idea, but why is that greater? Imagine it was a vampire trying to kill you. Is it better that it's around and you're interacting with it?
No, well, I think he'd say it's great. It's not greater in the sense that, yeah, that vampire's after me, but it's greater in the sense that it's like, now I really know it. Like, I'm not just thinking of it. I know it, and he's really here chasing me. And that's like this, I have this ultimate certainty of like, that vampire's really after me.
But that's just switching context. So the context of greater, lesser is supposed to be some kind of metaphysical thing that you can look at the two things and say one's superior to the other. Not you have knowledge about it or now you're certain that this thing exists. That's not what he's claiming. It's a claim about you can look at these two things and it's simultaneously that it's one thing and two things, which is part of why people find this incoherent when they first hear it. And he said, like, you have to go back and listen to it a couple of times because it should strike you as incoherent when it's if you have an idea and the thing out there, those are two different things. And yet it's simultaneously, they're two different, but it's the same thing. And now it's not just in the mind, but also out in reality. Now it's two, and it's it's got these two attributes instead of just one. It's not just in the mind, it's not just in reality, it's in both. That's two's better than one. So, and yet you can't simultaneously think it's the same thing. An idea in your mind and the thing out there are not the same thing. So It's all semantic. It's all the pretense that you know what greater and lesser means. And you can look at things and say, oh yeah, this is greater and this is lesser. And when he said, oh, it's obvious if you exist in the mind and in reality, that's greater than if you only exist in the mind. So not only is it not obvious, it doesn't actually have meaning. And so a lot of the arguments for the existence of God are the person already believes for other reasons, and then he just fishes around for things that seem to make sense or his opponent can't refute or can't point what's wrong. And then so I'm entitled to believe this. But it's not the reason he believes it. And the ontological argument is like this. Nobody actually believes in the existence of God because they heard the ontological argument. And then, oh, okay, now I get it. It's the semblance of understanding. And here, what the semblance that that, oh yeah, you can rank things as greater and lesser. Already that, I think, doesn't have meaning. And then you can do it obviously. Like I can give you two scenarios and you can, oh yeah, it's obvious that one's greater than this one. That's not true. And then so to say it's semantics is it's just words that you think you know what they mean, but you don't. And if you pause and really say, like, can I get beyond the words? You can't. He's not starting with observations. And if you're not starting with observations, typically what happens is you don't even know what you mean. So there's not real meaning because you can't point to the things. Like, this is what I'm talking about. And it has these kinds of properties, and I think it works like this. And then you're building on what you're observing to have hypotheses and theories and so. And that's exactly what is not happening.